The price of perfection. I wasn't supposed to fall in love with him. That wasn't part of the deal. The manicured lawn of the country club stretched before me like an emerald carpet, dotted with Silicon Valley's elite in their summer finery. My husband, the God, that word still felt foreign on my tongue after 6 months, stood across the terrace, entertaining investors with that practiced charm that had built his tech empire. His platinum wedding band caught the California sunlight as he gestured animatedly, probably explaining how his latest algorithm would revolutionize yet another industry. James Preston. 38. Net worth, $3.2 billion. My safety net. I took another sip of champagne, feeling the bubbles dance across my tongue, wondering if I'd ever get used to drinking bottles that cost more than my mother's monthly rent. The diamond on my finger felt heavy, a constant reminder of our arrangement. Security in exchange for the perfect wife. A transaction as clean as any merger he'd ever negotiated. You look like you'd rather be anywhere else, a voice said beside me, pulling me from my thoughts. I turned to find a man I didn't recognize. Tall, with dark hair that had the perfect amount of dishevelment, as if he'd run his hands through it several times. His blue eyes had laugh lines at the corners, and he wore a simple linen shirt that somehow stood out among the designer suits. He didn't belong here, and that immediately made him the most interesting person at the party. Is it that obvious? I asked, surprised by my own candor. He smiled, revealing a slight chip in his front tooth that somehow made him more real. Only to another prisoner of these obligations. He raised his glass in a subtle toast. I'm Noah. Event photographer. Hired to capture all these beautiful people pretending to enjoy themselves. Evelyn, I replied, deliberately leaving off my new surname. And I'm actually having a wonderful time. Liar, he said, but his smile took any sting out of the accusation. Your eyes keep darting to the exit like you're planning an escape route. I laughed despite myself. Maybe I am. Then you might want a better getaway plan. Security's tight when there's this much money in one place. Our conversation was cut short as James materialized at my side, slipping his arm around my waist with practiced ease. His touch was warm but perfunctory, like checking a box on a form. Darling, the Wilsons are asking about you, he said, his voice pleasant but carrying that edge that meant business. His eyes flicked to Noah. I don't believe we've met. Just the photographer, Noah said easily, stepping back with a deference that seemed both appropriate and subtly mocking. Your wife has a remarkable camera presence. You're a lucky man. James nodded with the confidence of a man who already knew exactly how lucky he was, not in having me, but in having secured the deal. Indeed. If you'll excuse us. As James guided me away, I couldn't resist glancing back. Noah had already raised his camera, but I could have sworn it was pointed directly at me, not at the supposedly important people James was leading me toward. That was the moment everything began to unravel. The moment I should have walked away but couldn't. Because for the first time since signing those prenuptial agreements, someone had looked at me, really looked at me, and seen past the designer dress and the perfect makeup to the woman underneath who was slowly suffocating. I hadn't always been this calculating. 3 years ago, I was Evelyn Chen, 29, struggling art gallery manager with student loans that seemed to multiply overnight and a mother whose medical bills were stacking up faster than I could open them. The gallery where I worked catered to tech moguls looking for statement pieces to hang in homes they rarely visited. That's where I met James. He came in looking for something impressive for his new headquarters. I sold him a massive canvas that cost more than my annual salary. 2 weeks later, he returned, ostensibly to discuss commissioning more art for his offices. By our third meeting, I knew he wasn't interested in the art. You're different, he told me over dinner at a restaurant where the menu had no prices. Intelligent. Direct. Unpretentious. What he meant was that I wasn't impressed by him. Not visibly, anyway. Inside, I was doing frantic calculations about how many of my mother's treatments his watch could cover. James was handsome in that polished, CrossFit and personal nutritionist way. His proposals, first for dates, then for a relationship, were presented with the same efficiency with which he ran his business. He didn't waste time with romantic gestures or uncertainty. He knew what he wanted, and 6 months into our relationship, he told me exactly what that was. My board wants stability, he explained as we sat in his minimalist living room overlooking the bay. The IPO is next year. Investors like family men. The bachelor tech genius narrative has expired. The proposal that followed wasn't about love. It was about compatibility, mutual benefit, and clear expectations. A 15-year contract with generous terms. Financial security for me and my family. The perfect corporate wife for him. My mother had raised me on stories of her escape from poverty in China, of sacrifices made for family, of practical choices over romantic ideals. Love is a luxury, she'd say while working her second job. When her multiple sclerosis diagnosis came, those words echoed in my mind as I watched her struggle to hold a paintbrush, the only joy she had left. So when James laid out his terms, I thought of her medical bills, of her hands that could no longer create art, of the relief in her eyes when I told her not to worry about money anymore. I said yes with open eyes. No delusions. A business arrangement with clearly defined benefits. The wedding was a spectacle designed for magazines and shareholders. I wore a custom gown that cost more than a car and smiled for cameras while James's mother whispered Mandarin in my ear, "Don't embarrass him. Remember where you came from." As if I could forget. Noah Hayes was a complication I hadn't anticipated. After our first meeting at the country club, I found myself looking for him at every event. He moved through these gatherings like a ghost, capturing moments no one else noticed. A forced smile. A tense handshake. The distance between couples who presented as perfect. 2 weeks after our first encounter, I was hosting a charity gala at our home, a modernist monstrosity perched on a cliff that James had purchased before we met. I was in the kitchen, hiding from socialite wives who asked prying questions about when we'd start a family, when Noah appeared. "The lady of the house shouldn't be hiding at her own party," he said, camera hanging from his neck. "I'm not hiding. I'm supervising the catering. The catering staff left an hour ago. Try again." I smiled despite myself. "Fine. I'm contemplating throwing myself off that ridiculous infinity pool to escape another conversation about private schools that haven't even accepted hypothetical children." He laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to cut through the artificial politeness of the evening. That would certainly make for a dramatic photo finish to the evening. "Why are you here, Noah? In the kitchen?" "Looking for the real story," he said, tapping his camera. "I don't do these gigs for the money. I have a series, Behind the Facade. Moments of authenticity in inauthentic spaces. And you think you'll find authenticity here?" I gestured around the designer kitchen that I barely used. "I just did." He raised his camera. "May I?" Something about the way he asked, like my answer actually mattered, made me nod. The shutter clicked, capturing me in my moment of escape, designer gown and bare feet, champagne in hand against the backdrop of a life that still didn't feel like mine. "Your husband's looking for you," he said after lowering the camera. Something about the donor announcement. I sighed, slipping my feet back into the tortuous heels. "Duty calls." "Evelyn," he said as I reached the door, "if you ever want to see real people doing real things, my exhibition opens next week. No designer labels required." He handed me a simple business card. I tucked it into my clutch, knowing I shouldn't go but already certain that I would. The gallery was in the Mission District, worlds away from the sanitized luxury I'd grown accustomed to. Noah's photographs lined exposed brick walls, stark, honest images that captured intimate moments, an elderly couple dancing in a kitchen, a woman crying alone in a wedding dress, children laughing in a thunderstorm. And there I was, barefoot in my designer gown, looking trapped and wistful. He'd titled it simply, Golden Cage. You came. His voice behind me carried no surprise, only quiet pleasure. I told James the first was meeting with a potential artist for his collection, I admitted. Am I being considered for the prestigious Preston collection? He raised an eyebrow. No, I said honestly. Your work is too real for his taste. We walked through the gallery as he explained each photograph. His passion was palpable, his vision clear. He photographed truth, moments of raw humanity in a world increasingly curated for social media perfection. Why these subjects? I asked as we stood before a particularly striking image of a homeless man sharing his food with a stray dog. Because we're drowning in curated perfection, he said. Everyone's selling an image. I'm interested in what happens when the camera catches people forgetting to pose. Like he'd caught me, I realized. Forgetting to be Mrs. Preston for just a moment. After the gallery, we walked to a tiny taqueria where the food was served on paper plates and cost less than the tip I'd leave at my usual lunch spot. We talked for hours, about art, about his childhood in Chicago, about my mother's paintings. I found myself telling him things I'd never told James, about my dreams of opening my own gallery showcasing immigrant artists, about the poetry I used to write, about my fears that I was slowly disappearing into the role I'd agreed to play. Why did you marry him? He finally asked, the question hanging between us in the cool night air as we walked back to where my driver waited. I could have lied. Could have constructed a love story worthy of his camera. Instead, I told him the truth, about my mother's medical bills, about the security James offered, about the practical decision of a woman with limited options. You had a choice, he said quietly. Did I? I challenged. When the alternative was watching my mother suffer? When I'd spent years working twice as hard as everyone else just to stay afloat? There are always choices, Evelyn. Sometimes they're just between different kinds of difficulty. When I returned home that night, James was in his home office, on a video call with Tokyo. He barely looked up as I passed, just nodded as if checking off wife returned home from his mental list of daily items. I lay awake that night, Noah's words echoing in my mind. Different kinds of difficulty. I'd chosen financial security over emotional fulfillment, telling myself it was the responsible choice. The adult choice. But for the first time since signing those prenuptial agreements, I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. Over the next 3 months, I created a new routine. Charity committee meetings that ran long. Art acquisitions that required personal attention. Gallery openings that couldn't be missed. James never questioned these absences. My cultural activities were valuable to his image, and he trusted me to maintain appropriate appearances. What he didn't know was that these excursions increasingly involved Noah. We visited obscure galleries in Oakland, went to poetry readings in Berkeley coffee shops, took his ancient Jeep to photograph the coastline at dawn when the light turned the ocean to molten gold. He showed me a San Francisco I'd never known existed despite living here for years, vibrant, real, unpolished. I justified these outings to myself as friendships. Harmlessly exploring parts of myself that had no place in my marriage. Noah never pushed for more, never made me feel like I was betraying anything. We were just two people who saw each other clearly in a world full of pretense. Until the day everything changed. My mother's condition had worsened suddenly. I spent 3 days at the hospital while specialists James had arranged conducted tests. When they finally stabilized her, I was exhausted, emotionally drained, operating on hospital coffee and fear. I called Noah from the parking garage, not even questioning why it was his number I dialed rather than my husband's. She's going to need full-time care, I said when he answered, my voice breaking. The doctors say the progression has accelerated. Where are you? He asked. Stanford Medical Center. Parking structure. Don't move. 20 minutes later, he found me sitting in my car, staring at nothing. Without a word, he opened my door, helped me out, and just held me while I cried for the first time since receiving the news. Not the controlled, camera-ready tears I'd mastered, but ugly, body-shaking sobs that left mascara streaks on his shirt. He drove me to Half Moon Bay, to a tiny hidden cove where the roar of the waves drowned out everything else. We sat in silence watching the sunset paint the water in impossible colors. His hand found mine in the sand, fingers intertwining as naturally as breathing. "I can't do this," I whispered, meaning everything and nothing. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said. "Just breathe." When he drove me home hours later, something had shifted irrevocably between us. We both knew it, both carefully avoided acknowledging it. As I stepped out of his car, he caught my hand. "You deserve to be seen, Evelyn. Not just photographed, truly seen." I pulled away and walked into my beautiful prison, where James was hosting a dinner for potential investors. He raised an eyebrow at my appearance, red eyes, wrinkled clothes, hair wild from the ocean wind, but said nothing until the guests left. "Your mother's doctor called me directly," he said, loosening his tie. "I've arranged for the best care facility in the country. The director owes me a favor, they'll take her next week." I should have been grateful. This was why I'd married him, for exactly this kind of problem-solving efficiency, this ability to make difficulties disappear with a phone call and a wire transfer. Instead, I felt hollow. "Shouldn't we have discussed this together?" He looked genuinely confused. "I thought you'd be pleased. The facility has an arts program. She'll be comfortable." "That's not the point, James. She's my mother. These decisions should include me." He studied me with the same analytical gaze he used on market projections. "You're upset. That's understandable given the stress of the situation. Perhaps you should take something and get some rest." "I don't need to take something. I need you to treat me like a partner, not another problem to solve." Something cold and evaluative flickered across his face. "I thought our arrangement was clear from the beginning, Evelyn. I provide solutions. You provide stability and appropriate companionship. Emotional demands weren't part of our agreement." The clinical way he referenced our marriage, our arrangement, crystallized everything I'd been feeling. I had entered this contract with open eyes, but somewhere along the way, I'd started wanting more than security. I wanted to be seen. To matter. To love and be loved, not just positioned advantageously in someone's life. I wanted what I felt with Noah, real connection that wasn't measured in market value. "Maybe the terms need to be renegotiated," I said quietly. James's expression didn't change, but his voice hardened slightly. "The terms are fixed, Evelyn. That was the point of the prenup. If you're finding our arrangement insufficient, I suggest you remember what your life looked like before I entered it." He wasn't wrong. Before James, I was drowning in debt, watching my mother deteriorate without access to proper care, living in a studio apartment with failing heat. He had rescued me from that life. Given me security, luxury, stability. But at what cost? That night, I lay awake beside him, listening to his measured breathing, wondering how I could have mistaken gratitude for something sustainable. Wondering if security without love was just another kind of poverty. The affair, because that's what it became, despite my protestations to myself, developed with a quiet intensity that terrified me. Noah never pressured me, never asked me to leave James. He simply offered me a space where I could be entirely myself, without performance or calculation. We were careful. Professional meetings in public. Private moments stolen in places no one from our world would ever go. His small apartment in the Sunset District became my sanctuary, a place filled with books and photography equipment and mismatched furniture that felt more like home than my minimalist mansion ever had. "I never meant for this to happen," I told him one rainy afternoon as we lay tangled in his sheets, the sound of the ocean just blocks away providing rhythm to our whispered confessions. "I know," he said, tracing patterns on my bare shoulder. "Neither did I. But here we are. What am I doing?" I whispered, more to myself than to him. "I made vows." "Business vows," he said. "A contract." That doesn't make breaking them right. He propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at me with those eyes that always saw too much. What are you really afraid of, Evelyn? Losing the security? Or admitting that you want more than what you settled for? The question hung between us, unanswerable in its accuracy. The double life continued for weeks that stretched into months. I became expert at compartmentalization, Mrs. Preston at charity galas and corporate events, Evelyn in Noah's tiny kitchen laughing over failed attempts at cooking. I told myself I was finding balance, taking what I needed from both worlds. But lives divided cannot stand forever. The first crack appeared when James's mother died unexpectedly. I stood beside him at the funeral, playing the role of supportive wife while he accepted condolences with stoic dignity. Only I noticed the slight tremor in his hand as they lowered the casket, the tightness around his eyes that betrayed actual emotion beneath the composed exterior. That night, he drank more than I'd ever seen, methodically working through an expensive bottle of scotch. When I tried to comfort him, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "She never thought you were good enough for me," he said finally, the words slightly slurred. "Said I should have married someone from the right background. Someone who understood the responsibilities that come with wealth." "I'm sorry," I said, unsure if I was apologizing for his mother's disapproval or my own inadequacies. "I told her you were exactly what I needed. Practical. Intelligent. Not driven by emotion." He laughed, a hollow sound that echoed in our massive living room. "I told her you understood the arrangement." Guilt twisted in my stomach. "James. Do you," he interrupted, suddenly focused, "understand the arrangement?" For a terrible moment, I thought he knew about Noah. That the private investigator I'd always assumed he must employ had finally reported back. But his next words revealed a different concern. "Because arrangements can be dissolved, Evelyn. Contracts can be terminated, with appropriate penalties." He refilled his glass. "If you're finding our arrangement unsatisfying." Relief mingled with a new kind of dread. He was offering me an out, at a price. The prenuptial agreement was brutally clear about infidelity. If I left, I would walk away with enough to pay for my mother's care but little else. Back to struggling, but this time with the added burden of a scandalous divorce. "Our arrangement works for me," I said carefully. "I've never indicated otherwise." He studied me with those calculating eyes, then nodded once. "Good. Because the IPO is next quarter, and I need everything to remain stable until then." The conversation haunted me for days afterward. Not just the implied threat, but the moment of vulnerability that had preceded it, the only time James had ever shown me anything beneath his polished surface. It made me wonder what else he kept hidden, what pain he concealed behind spreadsheets and strategic planning. It also forced me to confront the truth I'd been avoiding: I couldn't maintain both lives indefinitely. Eventually, something would break. The breaking point came sooner than I expected. James's company was celebrating a major acquisition, and the party at our home was filled with tech executives, venture capitalists, and the requisite cultural figures that made such gatherings seem less nakedly ambitious. I played my role perfectly, the charming hostess who knew just enough about technology to engage with the men and just enough about art to entertain their wives. I didn't know Noah would be there. A last-minute photographer cancellation had led the event planner to call him, his reputation growing enough that even the corporate world sought his eye. When I saw him across the room, something must have shown on my face because the woman I was speaking to turned to follow my gaze. "The photographer?" she asked with a knowing smile. "He is rather handsome in that artistic way. So different from our tech boys, isn't he?" I composed myself quickly. "I've hired him for the gallery before. He has a unique perspective." Throughout the evening, we maintained careful distance. Professional nods. Brief exchanges about lighting and angles. But in a house full of people trained to detect leverageable weaknesses, our efforts at indifference were apparently insufficient. Later, as guests were leaving, James's right-hand man Marcus cornered me in the kitchen. Interesting choice of photographer, he said, his voice casual but his eyes sharp. I've seen his work. Very intimate. My heart stuttered, but I kept my expression neutral. The original photographer cancelled. The event planner made the arrangements. Of course. He smiled thinly. Just unexpected to see someone with his perspective at a corporate event. His exhibition in the Mission was quite revealing. The exhibition, where my photograph had been displayed. Where anyone connected enough could have seen the wife of James Preston captured in a moment of unguarded longing. If you'll excuse me, Marcus, I should check on the remaining guests. He stepped aside, but his parting words froze me in place. James has always appreciated your discretion, Evelyn. It would be a shame to disappoint him so close to the IPO. The threat was clear. Marcus knew something, maybe not everything, but enough to be dangerous. And his loyalty was to James and the company, not to me. That night, after the last guest had gone and James had retreated to his office for post-event analysis with his team, I texted Noah, "We need to talk." Not safe to meet. His reply was immediate, Sutro baths. Tomorrow. 6 a.m. I deleted the exchange and spent the night staring at the ceiling, weighing impossible choices. The ruins of the Sutro baths stood sentinel against the dawn, the concrete remains of what had once been an elaborate bathhouse now serving as ghostly frames for the crashing waves. Fog wrapped around us like a protective cloak as I told Noah about Marcus's veiled threat. He knows something, I concluded. Maybe not everything, but enough. Noah's face was grim. Then we need to make a decision. Now. What kind of decision? Whether this us is worth fighting for. The question hung between us, weighted with everything unsaid. Was love worth sacrificing security? Was passion worth the practical consequences? These weren't just romantic questions but economic ones, class ones, ones that people with Noah's freedom or James's wealth might never fully understand. If I leave him before the IPO, he'll destroy me, I said. The prenup has clauses about damage to his reputation. He could take everything, even the money for my mother's care. So we wait until after the IPO. And then what? I'd trade my security for love, he finished simply. For a life that might have less money but more meaning. The ocean roared behind us, a constant reminder of forces beyond our control. It's not that simple. It never is, he agreed. But staying in a marriage without love, that's its own kind of poverty, Evelyn. My own words from months ago, reflected back to me. Security without love, another kind of poverty. But was love without security any better? I need time, I finally said. To figure out how to do this without losing everything. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. I'll wait. But not forever. As I walked back to my car, I felt something shifting, the careful compartmentalization of my two lives beginning to crumble. I couldn't keep being two people, living two stories. Eventually, I would have to choose. In the weeks that followed, I became hyper-aware of subtle changes in James's behavior. Nothing overt, he was too controlled for that, but small indicators that something had shifted. More questions about my schedule. Casual mentions of having seen me at places I hadn't told him I'd be. Marcus appearing unexpectedly at events where I was supposedly alone. I began to suspect I was being watched. The thought made me simultaneously angry and terrified. Angry that my privacy was being invaded, terrified of what they might already know. Noah and I became even more careful. No texts. No calls. Communications through a mutual friend who owned a gallery where I legitimately had business. Our meetings were less frequent, more precious for their rarity. Meanwhile, the IPO date approached. James grew more tense, more demanding of perfection in every aspect of our presented life. Appearances at key events. Interviews with carefully selected media. A photo shoot for a business magazine where we posed in our home like the perfect power couple, his steady hand on my shoulder, my adoring gaze directed up at him. When the magazine came out, Noah left a copy at the gallery with a yellow sticky note on our photo. Is this the story you want to tell? The question haunted me, especially as I watched my mother fade despite the expensive care facility. On my visits, she would sometimes look at me with piercing clarity and ask, "Are you happy, Evelyn?" And I would lie, telling her everything was perfect, knowing she saw through me just as she always had. During one visit, as I sat beside her watching her try to paint with hands that betrayed her, she suddenly said, "I never wanted this for you." The best medical care available? I tried to joke. She shook her head. A life without joy. I didn't escape China and work 3 jobs for you to live in a golden cage. The echo of Noah's photograph title was so precise it took my breath away. I'm fine, Mom. I have everything I need. Need isn't enough, she said with unexpected fierceness. Your father and I had nothing but we had love. That's why I could survive losing him, because I had known what it was to truly live first. I drove home in tears, her words breaking something open inside me. I had been so focused on security, on making the responsible choice, that I'd forgotten what I was securing that stability for. Not just survival, but living. Not just existing, but joy. That night, I lay awake beside James, studying his profile in the darkness. He was handsome, successful, and in his own way, exactly what he had promised to be. The problem wasn't him, he had never pretended to offer more than our arrangement outlined. The problem was that I had changed. I wanted more now. Needed more. The IPO was 2 weeks away. I made my decision. The plan was simple: maintain absolute normalcy until after the IPO. Continue playing the perfect wife. Make no waves. Then, once the shares were sold and the company valuation secured, I would ask for a divorce. Clean, professional, as businesslike as our marriage had been. I would accept the prenup terms, enough money to secure my mother's care but nothing like the wealth I'd grown accustomed to. Noah and I would start over. Modestly but honestly. What I didn't count on was James making plans of his own. 3 days before the IPO, I returned from visiting my mother to find him waiting in the living room, a folder on the glass coffee table before him. His face had the same expression he wore when eliminating competitors, cold, calculated, certain of victory. Sit down, Evelyn. Something in his tone made my skin prickle. I sat across from him, maintaining the composed facade that had become second nature. I've always appreciated your intelligence, he began, your understanding of how the world actually works. It's why I chose you. No romantic delusions. No messy emotions. He slid the folder toward me. Inside were photographs, Noah and me at the beach. Entering his apartment building. Talking intimately at a gallery opening. Nothing explicitly incriminating, but the narrative they built was clear enough. Marcus has been concerned about your discretion, James continued in that same detached tone. Given the importance of the IPO, I had to take his concerns seriously. My mouth went dry, but I forced myself to meet his gaze. These show nothing inappropriate. True. They're circumstantial. But enough to justify further investigation. He crossed his legs, perfectly at ease. The actual evidence is much more definitive. My mind raced through possibilities. Had they bugged Noah's apartment? Hacked our deleted texts? I'm not interested in humiliating you, Evelyn. That would serve neither of us. What I want is for you to understand your position clearly. And what position is that? If news of an affair were to emerge, the prenuptial agreement would be activated under the infidelity clause. You would receive nothing. Not even the funds for your mother's care. The threat hung in the air between us. I had expected anger, perhaps even hurt beneath the businessman exterior. Instead, there was only this cold assessment of leverage. What do you want, James? What I've always wanted. 2 more years. The IPO is just the beginning. The merger negotiations will take at least 18 months, and I need stability during that period. After that, we can quietly separate with the terms we originally agreed upon. 2 more years of pretending. Of living a lie. Of being without Noah. And if I refuse? His expression didn't change. Then I released the evidence to my lawyers. Your mother's care facility receives notification that payments will cease. And your photographer friend finds himself blacklisted from every gallery and publication that values connections with the tech industry, which, in this city, is all of them. The calculated cruelty of it stole my breath. Not just a threat to me, but to everyone I loved. You would destroy his career? I would remove an inconvenience from my business plan, he corrected. Nothing personal. Just proper risk management. In that moment, I saw James Preston clearly for perhaps the first time. Not evil, not even particularly malicious. Just utterly disconnected from the human cost of his decisions. People were assets or liabilities to be managed, nothing more. I need time to think, I said finally. You have until tomorrow. The IPO bell rings in 72 hours, and I need to know if I need to implement contingency plans. He left me sitting there, staring at the photographs that documented moments of genuine happiness, moments that now threatened everything. I went through the motions that night: dinner with James, appropriate small talk, retiring to separate rooms to work. But inside, my mind was racing, evaluating options that all seemed impossible. If I agreed to James's terms, I would secure my mother's care and eventually walk away with enough to start over, but at the cost of 2 more years of my life. 2 years without Noah, who had already waited so long. 2 years I might never get back. If I refused, I would lose everything material but keep my integrity, my chance at love. But Noah would suffer professionally, and my mother would lose the care she desperately needed. There seemed to be no path forward that didn't require terrible sacrifice. I texted Noah from a burner phone I'd purchased weeks earlier as a precaution: crisis. Meet at your exhibition space tomorrow. Noon. His response was immediate: I'll be there. That night, I lay awake in my separate bedroom in our perfect house, staring at the ceiling and thinking about how completely I had walked into this trap of my own making. I had chosen security over love once. Now I was being asked to make that choice again, but with the stakes impossibly higher. The next day, I dressed carefully for a lunch meeting that appeared on my calendar with a tech industry women's group, a perfect alibi for being away from home in the middle of the day. James barely glanced up from his preparations when I mentioned where I was going. Noah was waiting when I arrived at the gallery, now closed between exhibitions. The concern in his eyes when he saw my face made my heart twist painfully. What's happened? I showed him the photos James had presented, explained the ultimatum. With each word, his expression darkened. He's blackmailing you, Noah said when I finished. Using your mother as leverage. It's not just that, I said. He'll destroy your career too. Noah's laugh was bitter. My career can survive. I've never been part of that world anyway. But your mother's care, that's different. I don't know what to do, I admitted, the words catching in my throat. If I stay with him for 2 more years, I can secure her future. If I don't, then we find another way to pay for her care. There is no other way. Do you have any idea how expensive that facility is? My salary at the gallery barely covered our rent before all this. So we find a different facility. Not as luxurious, but adequate. And what about her doctors? Her specialists? The experimental treatments James's connections have access to? The practical realities hung between us. Love without security. The choice I had always feared making. Noah took my hands, his eyes intense. Listen to me. There's something I haven't told you because the timing never seemed right. But I've been offered a position, National Geographic. Documentary Photography Division. It would mean traveling, but the salary is substantial. Not billionaire substantial, but enough to help with your mother's care. When did this happen? Last month. I've been waiting for the right moment to tell you. Hope flickered briefly, then faded as I did the mental calculations. Even with that, it wouldn't be enough. Not for the level of care she needs. Then we figure it out together. That's what people who love each other do, Evelyn. They solve problems together. Love. He had never said the word directly before. It hung in the air between us, beautiful and terrifying in its implications. I love you, he continued, his voice steady. I want a life with you. Not just stolen moments between charity galas and business trips. Not just being your secret escape from a loveless contract. I want mornings and arguments and real life. Whatever that looks like. The truth of his words struck me with physical force. This was what I wanted too, not perfection, but authenticity. Not security at any cost, but connection worth sacrificing for. If I walk away from James now, before the IPO, he'll make good on his threats, I said, thinking aloud. But if I agree to his terms, 2 more years, he'll let us leave with enough to take care of my mother. Noah's jaw tightened. 2 years of pretending. Of us being apart. Of you sharing a home with him? I know, I whispered. It's impossible. Or. Noah hesitated. We could call his bluff. What do you mean? Your value to James isn't actually as a wife. It's as a perfect image. Stability for the investors. What if we offer an alternative arrangement? You maintain appearances for business events only. Separate lives otherwise. He'd never agree to that. He might if the alternative is scandal before the IPO. His threats only work if you care more about security than freedom. What if you show him you're willing to go public with everything? I stared at him, mind racing. Mutually assured destruction? Exactly. He has leverage over you, but you have leverage too. The perfect CEO with the imperfect marriage right before the biggest deal of his life? That's not the story he wants in the financial press. The audacity of it took my breath away. Fight manipulation with manipulation. Meet calculation with calculation. Use the very skills that had gotten me into this mess to get myself out. I need to think, I said finally. This is chess, not checkers. I need to be 3 moves ahead. Noah nodded, understanding in his eyes. Whatever you decide, I'm with you. Even if it means waiting. As I drove back to the mansion on the cliff, a plan began forming in my mind. Not a perfect plan, but one that might just work. James was in his home office when I returned, surrounded by screens of financial data, his team conferencing in virtually as they prepared for the IPO. He glanced up when I entered, annoyance flickering across his face at the interruption. I need to speak with you, I said. Privately. He studied me for a moment, then told his team to take 15. When the screens went dark, he turned to me with raised eyebrows. You've made your decision? I have a counteroffer, I said, my voice calmer than I felt. Something like surprise crossed his face before he controlled it. I wasn't aware this was a negotiation. Everything's a negotiation, James. You taught me that. I sat across from him, channeling every lesson I'd learned watching him in business meetings. Back straight. Eyes direct. No signs of weakness. Here are my terms. I'll maintain appearances through the IPO and merger negotiations as you requested. I'll be the perfect corporate wife in public. But in private, our arrangement changes immediately. Separate bedrooms officially, not just practically. Freedom to live our own lives discreetly. And when the merger is complete, we divorce amicably with the original prenup terms. James leaned back in his chair, evaluating me with new eyes. And the photographer? Is none of your concern as long as discretion is maintained on all sides. And if I refuse these new terms? This was the moment of truth, the bluff that would either liberate me or destroy everything. Then I call a press conference tomorrow explaining that our marriage has been a business arrangement from the beginning. I share the evidence of your emotional manipulation and threats regarding my mother's care. I become the sympathetic figure in a scandal that will dominate financial news instead of your IPO success. His eyes narrowed. No one would believe you without evidence. I removed a small recorder from my purse and placed it on his desk. The light blinked steadily. I've been taking precautions since Marcus made his threat at the party. Today's conversation is already backed up to secure cloud storage. It was a partial bluff. I had indeed been recording conversations, but not as systematically as I implied. Still, I had enough to create problems. For a long moment, James said nothing, his face unreadable as he calculated risks and probabilities. Finally, he gave a single, sharp nod. Acceptable terms, with one addition: no public appearances with him until after the divorce is finalized. Agreed. I stood, relief making my knees weak though I didn't show it. I'll have my lawyer draw up the agreement. Use my personal attorney, he countered. Greater confidentiality. Even now, he was thinking 3 steps ahead. I nodded my agreement and turned to leave. Evelyn, he called as I reached the door. When I turned back, his expression had softened slightly. I didn't expect this from you. It's impressive. It wasn't a compliment exactly, but perhaps the closest thing to respect he'd shown me since our marriage began. You chose me for my intelligence, I reminded him. Not just my discretion. The next 2 years were a strange dance of public performance and private liberation. James and I appeared together at corporate events, charity galas, and strategic social gatherings, playing the perfect power couple. I smiled for cameras, charmed investors, and spoke eloquently about the philanthropic initiatives that were our passion. Behind closed doors, we lived entirely separate lives. James traveled more, worked later, and eventually purchased a separate residence where he spent most of his time. I remained in the Cliff House, which felt less like a prison now that it was truly mine. Noah and I maintained careful discretion, but stopped hiding from ourselves. We traveled to places where Silicon Valley power players wouldn't be watching, small coastal towns, art communities in the desert, once even to his family home in Chicago where I met the people who had shaped him. My mother's health stabilized with the continued excellent care, and on my frequent visits, she noticed the change in me immediately. You're breathing again, she said during one visit, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for mine. I can see it in your face. The IPO was a historic success. James's company valuation soared beyond even the most optimistic projections. The merger negotiations proceeded smoothly, and 18 months into our new arrangement, he informed me that the timeline was accelerating. The papers will be ready next quarter, he said during one of our infrequent private conversations. My team suggests announcing the divorce immediately after the merger closes, a natural time of transition for both the company and its leadership. I nodded, surprised to feel a complicated mix of emotions. Not regret exactly, but acknowledgement of the strange intimacy that develops between any two people who have shared significant time together, even under artificial circumstances. You've kept your end of the bargain admirably, he added, something almost like warmth in his voice. The board has suggested creating a foundation as part of the corporate structure. They thought you might be interested in leading it, focusing on arts access for underserved communities. The offer surprised me. Wouldn't that be awkward after the divorce? He shrugged. Business is business. You've proven yourself a valuable asset independent of our personal arrangement. There was that word again, arrangement. But this time it didn't sting. Perhaps because now I was choosing it with open eyes and a free heart, not out of desperation. I'll consider it, I said honestly. 2 weeks before the divorce was to be finalized, my mother died peacefully in her sleep. The doctors had warned me her systems were failing, but the end came more suddenly than expected. I found myself standing in her room at the care facility, surrounded by her paintings and photographs, overcome by a grief that felt physical. I called Noah first, then, unexpectedly, James. Whatever our relationship had been, he deserved to know, and some part of me wanted him there. He arrived within the hour, efficient as always, but with a gentleness I hadn't expected as he handled arrangements and shielded me from decisions I was too overwhelmed to make. At the funeral, he stood beside me, a respectful distance between us but present nonetheless. Noah was there too, farther back, honoring our agreement to maintain public separation until the divorce was final. Two parts of my complicated life, separate but both real in their own ways. After the service, when most mourners had left, James approached me with an envelope. "I've had the lawyers modify the divorce settlement," he said quietly. "In light of your mother's passing." Inside was an amendment removing all restrictions on her medical care funds, instead converting the amount to a direct payment to me, no strings attached. "You don't need to do this," I said. "Our arrangement doesn't require it." "I know." For once, his businesslike demeanor slipped, revealing something more human underneath. Considerate recognition of a contract honorably fulfilled. As he turned to leave, I called after him. "James. Thank you. Not just for this. For my mother's care all these years." He nodded once, then walked away, back straight, every inch the successful CEO who had built an empire through careful calculation. The divorce was finalized with minimal public attention, overshadowed by news of the successful merger. The settlement left me with financial security, not wealth to match James's billions, but more than enough to build a new life. True to his word, he offered me leadership of the foundation, with genuine autonomy and a mission I believed in. After careful consideration, I accepted, on the condition that my personal life remain entirely my own. Business was business, after all. Noah and I moved into a modest house in the Oakland Hills, with views of the bay that rivaled those of the Cliff Mansion but felt earned rather than purchased. His photography career flourished, the National Geographic position leading to exhibitions in galleries that had nothing to do with tech money or social climbing. I opened a small gallery of my own, focusing on immigrant artists whose voices and visions deserved recognition. On weekends, I taught art classes at community centers, watching people discover the joy of creation the way my mother once had. Our life together wasn't perfect. We argued about money sometimes, the adjustments from unlimited resources to comfortable but finite ones occasionally causing friction. We disagreed about travel schedules and household responsibilities and all the mundane things that real couples face. But every disagreement, every difficulty, felt honest in a way my previous life never had. No performances, no calculations, just two people building something meaningful together. On the anniversary of my mother's death, we visited the oceanside park where Noah had first photographed me, the image he'd titled Golden Cage. We walked along the shore as the setting sun turned the water to molten gold, my hand in his, the weight of his ring on my finger still new enough to notice. "Any regrets?" he asked as we watched the waves crash against the rocks. "About how it all played out?" I thought about the question carefully, remembering the frightened, calculating woman I'd been when I'd signed that prenuptial agreement. How I'd convinced myself that security without love was the best I could hope for. How I'd nearly missed the chance at something real. "Just one," I said finally. "That I didn't understand sooner what my mother tried to tell me. That safety isn't the same as happiness. That a life without joy isn't really security at all." Noah squeezed my hand, his eyes crinkling at the corners the way I loved. "And now?" I looked out at the endless horizon, the limitless possibility of the ocean meeting the sky, and felt the kind of peace that comes not from the absence of risk but from the presence of love. Now I know the difference between the price of perfection and the value of reality. I turned to him, smiling. And reality wins every time. The end.